Oh, I need to tell everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Just to let you know, the headphones on the back of your seat do need turning on, so just with the white button. And then you should be able to hear me loud and clear. Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, welcome, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Kitty Hatchley. I am the media manager at InfluenceMap. We're very pleased that We Mean Business Coalition, Race to Zero, and Ceres have shared their platform with us so that we can be in this conversation on the vital role in all of this that we're discussing at COP of corporate accountability for climate policy influence. At InfluenceMap, we have tracked the corporate climate policy engagement of some of the world's largest companies and industry associations for almost a decade. And over that time, it has only become more obvious how important corporate engagement with climate policy is in the fight for the planet. We have observed at close quarters the ways in which negative actors, especially from the fossil fuel industry, drive resources into making their message clearly heard by policymakers. And also how these groups work together, how they share resources and arguments and tactics in order to really drive this point home. We've just launched our annual COP attendee resource, tracking how many of those actors are actually walking among us today, and our misinformation tracker, which puts a spotlight on the arguments that they will be using to undermine climate progress, even at what is supposed to be one of the most positive climate events of the year. So in order to stand a chance at countering these actors, we need to turbocharge positive work from companies. There are some companies out there that are carrying the torch, and we really try and highlight what they do, but there are far too few of them. Their voices are being drowned out not only by these negative actors, but sometimes by their own industry associations. And this is something that companies need to tackle head on. As the UN high-level expert group said in their recommendations this week, companies need to lobby positively. They need to join the conversation and advocate for the national level binding policy that will drive climate commitments and ambitious goals and standards, so that all companies are brought along on this economic transition. The cost of inaction is simply too high. And now I'm delighted to introduce Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, United States Senator from Rhode Island. Senator Whitehouse has been long a strong proponent of ambitious climate policy, both for the US and globally. He has also opined extensively on the role of the corporate sector in influencing the US government and the UN climate agendas. And we look forward to his remarks.
Thank you so much. The only additional thing I'd add about myself is that I've also long been an admiring fan of InfluenceMap and its work. I think if you look up InfluenceMap in the Senate transcript of floor debate, you'll see that I speak about InfluenceMap and your work all the time. Years ago, I started giving what came to be called time to wake up speeches, which started as, explanations of the science of climate change and what effect it was having on pteropods and polar bears and so forth. But as I dug into it more and more, those speeches began to turn at the climate denial apparatus that I was so obviously up against, but that most people weren't really paying attention to. They weren't aware of what an enormous armada of front groups, for instance, the fossil fuel industry had put up. But it was quite clear to me, because I came to the Senate in 2007, and for all of 2007, 2008, and 2009, we were having very robust, bipartisan debates on climate. There were 3 significant climate bills that were being kicked around in the Senate. John McCain carried the Republican banner into the 2008 presidential election on a good climate platform. So that's what I saw. That was my environment as a new senator. In January of 2010, all of that fell over dead. And it fell over dead, not coincidentally, at the time that the United States Supreme Court allowed special interests to spend unlimited amounts of money in politics. And sure enough, the fossil fuel industry, we've actually found out since, anticipated that decision, responded instantly, and by that November's elections was already heavily engaged. and they put immense pressure. I believe they went in to see Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, and had the following discussion. Leader McConnell, we can now give you unlimited money. You don't have to admit that it's us. We have front groups set up all over the place that we can launder it through. It'll come in with names like Americans for Prosperity. And how'd you like $100 million for the next set of races? Well, that was unheard of before, but there it was. And at that point, I think he sent the signal out to all the Republicans who'd been working with us on climate change, hey, this stops now. This was, in my view, a pay-to-play. So when InfluenceMap came in and started to look at all of this and started to rank the performance of some of these groups, it to me was no surprise that the National Association of Manufacturers and the American Petroleum Institute and the so-called U.S. Chamber of Commerce were worst climate obstructors. What the U.S. Chamber of Commerce refuses to do is to tell anyone who's been funding it. There's a regular dues, but they can't do what they do with regular dues. Something else has to be going on. They refuse to tell it. They've refused my requests officially, unofficially. They won't even tell their own members how they're funded. Because I think if you asked the question and got it answered, where has your money, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, come from since that January 2010 day when huge special interest dark money entered American politics? You'd find out that it was the fossil fuel industry that was propping up the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And it became as responsive to the fossil fuel concerns as a glove is responsible to the hand inside of it. So that machinery still operates. We're a little bit more aware of it. I'll give two examples of that machinery in operation that we've experienced recently. The first was when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. Instantly, gas prices jumped in the United States of America. Nothing had actually happened in America to change those gas prices, but they instantly jumped. And with that instant jump also came an instant campaign blaming President Biden for high gas prices. And he and we were caught flat-footed. I filed a bill to claw back those profits to give us a rhetorical talking point to show, wait a minute, you can blame Joe Biden for high gas prices, but he doesn't set gas prices. You set gas prices. You're the industry. You decide what the price is on that gas pump. And they had a choice then. They could have kept the gas prices low, but they followed the international cartel that they are such an important part of to drive those prices up. So it took a long time to push back on the Biden is inflation. And in fact, I think one of the reasons we didn't win this election is because that had stuck for so long. However, if you actually look at it, the first part of inflation was a deliberate price gouge by the fossil fuel industry. Then, as climate change began to hammer, you saw exploding home insurance and car insurance costs baked into that equation. And then, as climate continued to work out, you began to see more and more commodity prices raised as drought and flooding interfered with the ordinary operation of markets, as droughts kept the Mississippi and the Panama Canal down so low that it delayed and made shipping more expensive, and so forth. I think what we really saw was climateflation, that the fossil fuel industry did a brilliant job of hanging on to Joe Biden through this whole archipelago of phony front groups that they run. And we don't have anything to keep up with that. And because they do a good job of picking what the outlet is at any given time, it's hard for a busy newspaper editor who's not tracking the 100, say, phony front groups to put it in the context of what's actually happening. So they got away with it. So that was one example. The second example that I will use is the anti-ESG operation that was run in the United States. So ESG was almost entirely about environmental stuff in terms of what corporations were doing, and the anti-ESG movement was almost entirely about those environmental things. What was happening in real life was that climate threats had become so real, not just science predictions any longer, they had become so real that they had hit the fiduciary horizon of groups and individuals who had fiduciary responsibilities. CEOs, corporate boards of directors, investment managers, stockbrokers, people who had duties to others to be accurate about climate and to respond reasonably and prudently about climate suddenly had to start baking that in. And when the fossil fuel industry saw that happening, it created its anti-ESG operation, which I describe as basically a very large Broadway show that just happened to get loose from Broadway and run around Washington and New York and in the streets acting as if something real was happening. But in my view, in the same way that a Broadway play has actors and scripts and directors and producers, the entire anti-ESG movement was a fossil fuel production with actors and scripts and directors and producers. And we're still tangling with that apparatus. So as we try to fight our way through to a pathway to climate safety, it matters strategically that we keep our attention on the climate denial apparatus. It's not enough just to talk about pteropods and polar bears and green jobs. We've got to let people know that they're being lied to on an industrial scale through a whole armada of phony front groups and captive lobbying organizations like the Chamber and API and others. It's not just a question of calling out the bastards. We actually, I think, need to do a better job of that so we don't get knocked back by fake Biden inflation claims, so we don't get knocked back by anti-ESG movements that are nothing but fossil fuel funded productions, and so that we can fight the rhetorical battle with the fossil fuel industry with a knowing audience that actually gets the joke about who's for real and who's just a propped up phony. So that's what I would like to share with all of you. I live in this world. I see it all the time. If you want to read something fun, a brand new report out of Brown University by Robert Brulle, B-R-U-L-L-E, who has done very good work in this space, first at Drexel and now at Brown, looks at comprehensively Koch Industries and its apparatus and what it has done to create mischief and foment lies and create doubt and distrust about climate science. We all know that they've been doing it, but this is a really deep, good drill down that brings out a lot of new information and reports. And sadly, if that report went the other way, Fox News would be talking about it 24/7, 365. But because it's on our side, it probably is going to go on shelves someplace, and you've never heard of it, and you probably never will hear of it, except for me talking about it to you now. So bravo, InfluenceMap, and to all of you for your focus on the disinformation apparatus that has been such an essential part of our climate failure. And thank you.
Questions if anyone wanted to raise their hand. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Anthony Moff. I'm a law professor from Maine. Can you not hear me?
Yeah.
You got me now?
I just think this isn't working.
I can talk loud.
Try that.
Hi, Senator. My name's Anthony Moff. I'm a law professor from the University of Maine. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on what Vermont is doing and has done and what New York is considering doing in enacting state-level legislation that holds fossil fuel companies accountable financially for the harm of climate change and paying for adaptation.
Yeah, I think it's outstanding. I think that the fossil fuel industry machinery has squirreled its way around liability for a long time. I think that ultimately they will be found liable. One of my heartbreaks about the Biden administration is that despite abundant, what a litigant would call predication, the Biden administration refused to even investigate whether the fossil fuel industry's campaign of disinformation was equivalent to the tobacco industry's campaign of disinformation, which the Department of Justice litigated against and won in a thumping verdict that caused the decision from Judge Kessler, I think it was, in the D.C. District Court, thou shalt lie no more. And by the way, you got to clean up the lies you told. And when she told the tobacco industry, thou shalt lie no more, and put them under a court order, the entire public health trajectory of the tobacco issue changed. So for 4 years, I berated Attorney General Garland for not giving that an honest look, and I'll berate him again now for not giving it an honest look. But I do think that where the civil justice system has not done its job, for state legislatures to enact laws like that is perfectly fair and sends a powerful signal to the fossil fuel industry that they're no longer immune from consequence. I mean, this is an industry that's been immune from consequence for a long time. They cheat economically by shoving all of their negative externalities onto the rest of the world. They lie in probably the biggest propaganda campaign in history, and they're creating massive global damage implacably without the least bit of care. So I'm for both of those. We got to rein them in to save ourselves.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Naoko Ishii. I was the former CEO of the GEF, Global Environment Facility, where I was in Washington. Really
Spoken
appreciate.
before, yes, nice to see you.
we
Sorry.
did. Yeah. No, thank you so much for your support during that time. It's such a informative story, and I think that the world should know more about it. But my question for you is anti-ESG movement.
Yep.
And while I fully now understand what's behind it, but there may be also economic reason behind it, because it's not only US now, it's spread it to the world, including Europe. So there may be another reason, that is the world is still very much fossil fuel based field economy, and to create a profitable business under that environment is very, very challenging, because we really don't put enough price on natural capital or some good things. So it's more like fighting against this current the system is very, very challenging. So do you think that we also need to think about how to fundamentally shift economic way of seeing that a profit, seeing more of the valuing the natural capital?
Yes, I think the fossil fuel industry has for a long time been operating outside of the laws of economics. Under the laws of economics, the negative externalities, the harms associated with a particular product need to be baked into the price of the product, otherwise it's a market failure, it's a subsidy. The IMF says that just in the United States, that subsidy for the fossil fuel industry has now crossed $700 billion every year, which creates all sorts of economic dislocations in terms of clean energy trying to have a fair shot against it. It also gives a massive incentive to corrupt Congress. Because if you're spending, let's say, $7 billion a year on corrupting Congress so that you can protect your $700 billion a year subsidy, that effort to corrupt Congress is your most profitable product line. And I think until we go back to real economics and real enforcement on the justice side, it's going to be very hard to fight uphill against the tides of the pressure for self-preservation, I guess, by them.
And maybe just one final question from us, Senator.
Yes.
How you see this with these trends you've described, going forward into the next administration, what do you see the biggest challenges to be? What do you think needs to be done?
I think, well, first of all, again, thank you to InfluenceMap for what you have done. You've just been spectacular. When we have had the friendly administration of Joe Biden, it has been more productive usually to press for better regulations, faster regulations, a good law. The IRA was a huge Senate effort. And a lot of attention went into trying to get things right and urge them along doing their executive jobs. We don't have that luxury any longer, and now I think we are in a much more robust period of rhetorical engagement, and that gives us, I think, a real strong motive and opportunity to go back and focus more on all this fossil fuel mischief, the phony apparatus, all of that, because that's a very important area to focus on, and because it can help get people riled up so that 2026 reverses what 2024 did, at least in Congress. So the conversation, I think, for the next 2 years has to be about corruption. Over and over again, in my experience, when corruption has been raised as an issue about an administration, it has been very effective at causing people to take a second look. And I really think that everything having to do with the way the Trump administration responds to the fossil fuel industry reeks of corruption, right down to his public quid pro quo offer, give me $1 billion and I'll give you everything that you want. So we can engage very aggressively on this. You do have to know your stuff a bit. Again, why InfluenceMap is so important. You lay it out for people who haven't done the work themselves. But if you lay it out so that people understand what is going on, if they know that these are the groups that are connected, then I think we can make some real progress. I'll give you one closing example. There was a case in the Supreme Court recently about dark money and whether states could find out whether a so-called charitable organization was who was funding them. The Bonta versus Americans for Prosperity Foundation case. What was left out of that whole case is that the present state of the art for corrupting political influence in the United States of America is a twinned 501c3 and 501c4. The 501c4 is allowed to do some political spending. The 501c3 is not. The 501c3 gets a tax deduction. The 501c4 does not. And every self-respecting creepy special interest now has a 501c4 and a 501c3 that have the same offices, the same staff, the same donors, the same board. You could pierce the corporate veil with a banana. And on the other side of the corporate veil from Americans for Prosperity Foundation was Americans for Prosperity. What is Americans for Prosperity? It is the prime battleship in the Koch brothers' political influence armada. But nobody knew that. And the Americans for Prosperity Foundation didn't even disclose in its briefing to the Supreme Court, nor did the other groups funded by Americans for Prosperity that came into the Supreme Court to back up AFPF's arguments. None of them disclosed in their amicus briefs or in their other briefing. By the way, the difference between Americans for Prosperity Foundation and Americans for Prosperity is essentially none at all. So we got to learn a better skill set at telling this story. When we do, people are ready and eager to listen, and it is impactful.
Thank you so much.
Hi everyone, can you hear me now? Excellent. My name's Dominic Gogol. I'm a Deputy Director for Policy at the We Mean Business Coalition, and I'm going to lead us for the second half of this agenda. Firstly, we heard a robust series of points from the Senator there in terms of how corporate advocacy landscape is currently operating in the US, and particularly the role of vested interests in order to hold up climate policy. And then the second half of the agenda, what we're going to cover now, is more from a leading company and from a leading investor. What can be done to overcome this? What are the actions that companies are currently taking to mainstream responsible policy engagement, to improve how they advocate, and also how they're working with their peers, how they're working with their fellow companies, how they're working with their fellow investors, to ensure that policymakers are hearing loud and clear that companies or investors support robust climate policy and regulation, because it's in business interest, it is in their interest to have the supportive policies that they need in order to decarbonize. And our work in this space so far has really focused on, we created a framework for responsible policy engagement, which brought together all the available tools that companies currently use to advocate, examples of best practice, and where companies are working together to really make a change. And over the last 2 years, we've built out this framework. We've talked to leading companies, we've talked to leading investors in order to really ensure that companies are able to be better advocates, and sometimes that takes internal steps are needed. Companies need to work with their own board, they need to work with their different operations in different geographies in order to ensure that there's alignment within a company. In other times they need to work with their trade groups, so they need to work externally with other leading companies to ensure that policymakers are hearing the call for robust policies from companies loud and clear. And that's where our work so far has been. But now I want to get some perspectives from a company and from an investor to hear a bit more. And this empty chair, by the way, is for Thomas Lingard, who is on his way, we hear, but he's currently at the Indonesian pavilion, just finishing up events, and hopefully he will join us during the discussion. So with that, I will pass to Peter to talk through kind of to give himself an introduction, but then also to briefly respond to some of the remarks that the Senator made. I think you need to turn it on.
Thank you, Dominic, for that introduction. And it was indeed a very interesting keynote from Senator Sheldon, Whitehouse, on sort of how he sees the influence in the US, which I think is probably even larger than I might have anticipated before this session. So my name is Peter van der Werf. I'm head of active ownership for Robeco. We're a global asset manager based in the Netherlands, managing 180 billion euros assets under management for a range of pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds and others across the globe. And sustainability investing is really at the core of how we make our investments, both on an equity and a fixed income side. The purpose for me coming out to COP29 is to engage with companies and with sovereigns. So I've been speaking to various delegates on climate policy because all of that informs our view on how we think about climate performance of the companies we invest in. We particularly look at climate performance through what we call our traffic light. And within that traffic light, there's a couple of elements that are really important. One of them is indeed climate lobbying. So we basically look at targets that companies set. We look then at the way how they are able to invest their capex to live up to make the investments to follow through. But then another element I think is a key point where we use a lot of the work from InfluenceMap is on corporate policy advocacy, and if that is in support of their climate strategy or if it is undermining their climate strategy. And I think that's in short where we as an investor really use a lot of the work that's put out by InfluenceMap, and where we also see a huge role for sort of either accelerating the transition because companies are supportive of climate policy through their advocacy work, or indeed slowing down. And I think the story we just heard from Senator Whitehouse is obviously a very clear case of what he has been experienced over the past 17 years of very strong focus on slowing down climate policy developments within the US. And obviously a lot of the companies we invest in are US based, and we have significant holdings in the energy sector as well. So this is really where it comes at the core of our work. But maybe later on we can dive into a few examples of also where we've seen best practice on dealing with climate policy advocacy.
Thank you very much, Peter. Great to have you. And now I'll pass to Julie from the Velux Group.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for having me here. So at Velux, we produce fresh air and daylight in the shape of roof windows and skylights, and we've been doing that for 80 plus years. I have to say, this is my last speaking engagement on my last day of COP for this year, and I arrived here pretty cheerful, I have to say, after a good week, and then my heart sank, because I was, of course, not unaware that there is a lot of sort of money and corporate interest in politics, but I have to say the scale that was just sort of highlighted to us is truly shocking. From a European perspective, it's less true in a sense that there is less direct sponsorship of political parties. However, we also see, of course, that people on the other side of history, as I like to call it, are significantly better funded than we are, and therefore can put forward much more lobbying material, simply, and messages. Now, from Velux, from my perspective, I often say to my colleagues internally that the biggest part of my job is being good at drinking coffee and being nice. And by being nice, I mean approachable, open, good at sharing information, being able about where I have that information from, and passing it to the relevant people, because that's really sort of the essence, I think, of being a good lobbyist and being a good sort of transparent lobbyist. It's being clear about, what your message is, what that message is based on, and then leaving it up to people to then interpret that information. And the way we concretely go about it is we are, for instance, members of 3 of the associations mentioned here before, where we do work with Climate Group, we do work with corporate leaders groups, both in the UK and at EU level, and we're also very heavily engaged in WBCSD. So, and all those groupings are also groupings that have certain vetting criteria for joining, which means you can't just come in from a sideline and say, hey, we'd like to save the climate, please can we join? But you actually have to fulfill certain criteria. And that, I think, is really important for us, because for our own reputation, we also, of course, want to be associated with other people who are doing a good piece of work. Now, why do we want to do that? We want to do that because it's the right thing to do. And we changed last year in Velux from being a company with a sustainability strategy to having a sustainable strategy, right? So it's really anchored at the heart of our company. But at the end of the day, we want to sell our products and our solutions in a fair marketplace. And the marketplace isn't fair when there are people out there who do not live up to the rules set out for the quality, for the environmental footprint, and so on and so forth of your company. And that's something that's going to grow in the years to come. So we need to push the green and sustainable framework. But also we need to push that in a way where those people who play by the book actually remain competitive. And that's the biggest concern for us, I would say. And that's also a key reason why we're engaged in all these platforms. And I think what's really strong about those platforms is very often we come from different corners, but we have the same base issues. For instance, something like sourcing materials. We produce windows, PepsiCo produces, well, Pepsi's. But when you look at the base materials behind that, it's the same. It's aluminium, it's glass, it's plastics, right? So by coming together, all those of us who are invested in making a green transition, we can also create a footprint and therefore a significance in the discussion. And I mentioned Pepsi because I happened to be in a panel with them the other day. And that's what COP also does. It brings those of us who do agree together in a room. And a final point is, somebody asked me the other day, but why are you here? Shouldn't you be boycotting this if the oil and gas industry is also present and if we are in an oil producing country? But of course, from my perspective, that's the worst thing you can do, because if we're not here and our special interest is in built environment, there's certainly going to be no one out there saying, ooh, and let's not forget about buildings and the sustainable development goals and energy efficiency and all that stuff. So we will never be able to compete with the oil and gas sector in terms of funding. But what we can do and what we are doing, and these organizations that I just mentioned are helping us do that, is to gang up and with that increase the voices that speak what we believe is the truth.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Julie. And now I'll pass to Thomas Lingard from Unilever, who will kind of briefly introduce himself, and then we'll kind of have a wider, open up for a wider discussion.
It's very awkward coming into a panel so late that you've no idea what's just been said. I'm very sorry for being late. I was on another panel at the Indonesian pavilion with some government folks that was running over quite a lot. So my name is Thomas Lingard. I lead environmental sustainability at Unilever. This whole area of policy advocacy and influence has been a sort of passion point of mine for some time, since we started doing advocacy work in around 2012 at the international level, and then realizing what we were up against. And it's been a long journey to get to where we are today, where this is now recognized as a really big issue. They are awful. I'm going to take those off. Thank you. So what should I talk about? The work we've been doing on our disclosure. Yeah, so we started working out what we could do realistically in this space. We started out with an open letter from our CEO to all of our trade associations saying, just FYI, we've signed up to the Paris Agreement. We hope you are too. And if you're not, let us know. And we asked our local teams in markets to go around and engage with trade associations and find out whether they were publicly aligned to 1.5. Were they publicly aligned against it? And often it's a grey area in between that we like to probe around in and see what's going on. We stepped up that subsequently with a kind of more detailed report on what we got from that. And this year we commissioned, it was this year, maybe the end of last year, we commissioned an independent report from Volans, who did really good deep dive work on, not all, but our biggest trade associations, to try and look for evidence of either positive or negative engagement in line with the policies we'd set out. And then we've published that on our website. So we think there's something in this. We think this could become a standard part of climate disclosure, and we certainly think it's helpful in raising the debate around what's going on that people aren't aware about.
Thank you very much for that, Thomas. And this is exactly actually where I want to take the discussion. If I could ask the other panelists, what are the practical steps that companies can take to improve how they advocate, whether that's internally within the business or whether that's externally with their trade associations in particular?
Thanks for that question, Dominic. So from an investor perspective, we obviously evaluate a lot of different companies on their performance, and therefore we also see indeed where best practice sits. When I asked in the team earlier today, indeed Unilever was mentioned as one of the key examples there in our listed equity space in terms of how we would evaluate that. And from that perspective, it is really important to understand where a company starts from its policy advocacy positions, and then what are all of the relationships to its industry associations. So particularly within the energy or in the materials sector, we've been asking companies to disclose their ties to industry associations and ultimately then give insights into where these policy positions are that they advocate on behalf of the company. Some have done, others have been very reluctant to give this information. Some of them do it selectively, so they might give information for developed markets, but refrain from giving the same insights for emerging markets. So these are some of the things that we're pushing for in our engagement, because ultimately this is where we also think that companies can make a difference. Now we invest in more than 3,000 companies globally, and we have significant engagement with 300 of them. So there's still a large number that we will not have these individual conversations with. And so I think all of the attention that parties like InfluenceMap and others can give to this topic will ultimately hold these companies accountable. But it is indeed a very important sort of undercurrent to climate policy work that is very important to understand it properly.
And seeing that you covered the sort of external angle, I'll say a little bit about the internal angle, because I think in a company such as ours, we're not small, we're also not super big, but still, I mean, there are many different sort of interests within a company like ours, and people have a certain function. And so what's been really important for us is to have that strong internal anchoring around what we're doing and how we're doing it, to set up a system so that everyone, no matter what they said, what market, what function, adhere to those same principles. Because to your point, and I know anecdotally from a past company I worked in, we didn't even have a complete list of all the trade associations and subcommittees that people were involved in across countries. That's a huge piece of work, and making sure that you actually know even where we are and what we're saying and what we're committing to through all those different sort of associations and alliances is a huge task in itself, and one that's very important to keep grabs on. So at Velux, I mean, that's really been a key part of the puzzle, because of course there are people who are more concerned about this than others, but we've really sort of made it clear throughout the organization that this is primordial. It's more important than anything else that the people we deal with are who they say they are, and that they fundamentally sort of agree with the path we've chosen.
Great, thank you very much for that. So from what was talked about, there comes a clear need for collaboration between like-minded companies, whether that's inside a trade association, that's within a sector where they spot an identification. Sorry, just being told how to use the mic better. So I'd wonder if the panelists can reflect on what are the type of collaborative models that could be used, whether it's investors working amongst themselves, whether it's companies working amongst themselves, or a combination of investors and companies in how they advocate and how they engage policymakers and their peers towards the objective of raising climate policy ambition. Go left to right?
Wow. Let's start with the investors. They own the companies.
Yeah. Yeah, so from an investor perspective, we collaborate in different programs, such as Climate Action 100, where we look at, in this case, 167 largest companies from a carbon footprint and how they deal with climate lobbying. So within what we call the net zero benchmark, this is one of the points that is evaluated and companies are scored against. So this is already very transparent there. Unfortunately, a lot of them score very poorly in that category. So there is a lot of work to be done. And I think also, yeah, when you think about your trade associations that you're members of and the public policy positions that they take and all of the advocacy work that they do, obviously there is a very good reason why companies enter into these trade associations and why they want to be represented. But there is also indeed a space where ultimately there is positions that these trade associations take that no longer sort of are consistent with your own positions. And I think this is always a very hard debate when companies will take a decision to leave a trade association. Often there is quite a bit of press attention for these steps. And it then also raises questions for those that still remain in the trade association. So I think that is where we would call upon companies to evaluate that on an annual basis very carefully, and then also be transparent to investors and the market why they are members of a certain association, what is the purpose, and also how they see this support their sustainability strategy.
I was just thinking this also offers up an interesting conundrum though, because if people then, if the good companies and the committed companies then leave these trade associations, then you're left behind with a group of companies that are even more sort of unambitious in their outlook. And depending on what that association is, that might not necessarily be a good thing. And here I'm thinking about in Europe, for instance, the Business Europes of this world and all the national associations that, certainly cover a huge variety of topics and opinions, some of which are closer to ours than others. But in that case, it's also sometimes a question of staying in and working from within rather than leaving them to it. And I think what we can really do as a company, of course, and you sort of mentioned it as well, Thomas, is placing demands on our own, the people we source materials from, for instance. Because if we insist on our supply chain to live up to certain standards, they in turn will insist their partners to live up to those standards. And with that, you're then creating a sustainable business chain. And at the end of the day, that's what we need to do. We need to create a framework in which it is also business opportune to invest in good climate regulation. And then I think one more point to the senator before, who was very taken with calling out the lies. I totally understand that sentiment, and I think many of us have it. But also there's a lot of research out there that shows that people who are not convinced will climb higher and higher and higher up that tree the more we try to convince them differently. And if I can look at something that I don't think we've done particularly well in the built environment sector and in the energy efficiency sector, it's to communicate in a way that actually resonates with people out there. We know we're right. We know there are lots of benefits. We know that energy efficiency is the cheapest way to decarbonize, so on, blah, blah, blah. We know that. We agree and we sit in circles. We're not. But what we haven't been good enough is to make that argument in a way where we really take everybody else on board. And that's also a communications exercise. And part of that communications exercise, again, is of course tied to the budgets we don't have. But we really need to become better here, because it's not enough that we have the truth and can explain the truth in a very long white paper. We need to explain it in a way where others join us, and then we can have a discussion about the details.
As you were speaking then, I had a flashback to a very emotive conversation with a colleague who was on a national trade association and somewhere in the world, and I was giving them a bit of a hard time about the awful position that had come out of that trade association. They were like, honestly, you should have seen the first draft. Like, I was really proud we'd got it to here. And so, you know, it is a tough call to know whether to say, just don't do any of that work, let it be awful, step right away from it, knowing that actually that trade association minus Unilever still has a lot of power. And so that they are really tough decisions. And they're also really tough decisions to find out which trade associations you're in, you know, when you're a distributed leadership kind of company in 190 countries. And how we think about what are the ones that really matter from a climate policy perspective. I've now lost the question. What was the question? Collaborative models. Yeah, I mean, we have plenty of experience of trying to get kind of coalitions of the willing, or sort of progressive movements within trade groups and so on, even voluntary ones. It is pretty challenging. I mean, I think getting more standardization into what people are required to disclose will help, because more people will be able to see who else has the same challenges in the same place. Whether it's geography specific or industry specific or ingredient in value chain specific, you know, to your point. Yeah, I mean, we've tried lots of things. Obviously, when you do stuff with other people, it ends up being slower than if you do it on your own. But I suspect we'll have to overcome those barriers.
Well, thank you for that. And on the business narrative, what Julie was talking about, I'd like to point to a new piece of research that we put out over the last month, and it was on just this, and it was with Potential Energy, who are a group of fantastic Madison Avenue advertising execs who looked at lots of what we put out in the business climate literature, and really fundamentally challenged about how we use morality and science in the way that we communicate about the actions that climate do, and that not only doesn't resonate with many of your typical companies, it also doesn't resonate as much with consumers. And they've written us a whole business narrative which we're now using and socializing with the companies that we work with, and it talks about the material risk of climate and how companies need to talk about in materiality terms, that this is a risk for the operations of your business and ultimately the services and products you want to continue to supply to your customers, and that changes the public perceptions around why climate is so important to how companies are investing and how they're working. So I'd encourage you all to take a look at that narrative, because it's a really powerful series of kind of proof points about how companies should talk about climate. But I wanted to move our discussion on to, we started with the Senator talking about the powerful role that vested interests have had on slowing climate policy, and I think me, like the panelists and much of the room, felt this was an enormous challenge, and how are we going to overcome it? So I thought it would be helpful to hear reflections from the panel about successes, about where they've seen wins, where they've been proud of how they as a company stood up, or how they worked with companies to stand up and ultimately were able to secure ambitious climate policy, regulation, whatever it might be, to kind of leave on maybe a slightly more uplifting note. Whoever would like to start.
Yeah, happy to take that question, Dominic. So I just had a conversation here at COP with a mining company, Australian mining company, Rio Tinto, who had gone through a process of developing, from our perspective, quite a strong sort of top-down climate policy, and we've had many years of very constructive dialogue with them. And for us to be then actually quite surprised when in the course of, I think it was August, there was a letter coming out which they had signed from their Australia business to actually slow down climate and nature policy, the EPBC Act in Australia. And to me this is a success story, not so much because of what happened with the letter, but as we engaged with the company, with Climate Action 100 and many other actors, they really sort of noticed that they had dropped the ball. They went through an internal process, and I think it was 4 weeks ago that they came with a public statement saying, yes, we were wrong, we've reconsidered our position, and we're actually now in support of this legislation and moving through. So to me this is an example, not so much of a company that got it right the first time, but that was actually willing to then also go through that process. And I think it's also a very clear sign that not every public policy letter goes through all of the different places where you need to sign it off. So that is actually a question I would have for you, Thomas, in terms of how you've organized that on a Unilever side with so many different offices and so much of public policy work, how you keep that consistency from sort of your top-down policies as all of these different policy advocacy efforts go out. Because Rio Tinto, it didn't work in the first time, but they fixed it. But I'm very curious how you approach that from a Unilever perspective.
Yeah, I'm not sure we've totally nailed it. If I'm honest, I wouldn't want to put my hand up and say we've got this licked. It is very challenging, and obviously the reason why you join trade associations is often because you don't have very much corporate affairs resource, particularly in smaller countries where you're operating. You know, you don't have a maybe government affairs person, so you join a trade association and they do it for you. So it is a challenge. I mean, on the kind of good news story case study, I'm racking. I can think of lots, but many I know were confidential meetings, so I'm in a difficult position. But I'll try and anonymise one. There was definitely one large country where we were involved in a conversation. It was a direct conversation with government at the ministerial level about whether that country should set a net zero target or not. And a group of companies went in from a progressive business coalition in that country and sat down for an hour and a half with those ministers and some other government staff. And we were all companies that had set our own net zero targets. And what was really interesting is that it wasn't like a massive policy evidence base that we went in with. We just said, look, we set these targets. We've no idea how we get to net zero, but like we think it's a really important statement of belief in the possible, what's possible, and in triggering a transformational mindset inside the organization. Because if you think you're just going for a little bit more, a little bit or a little bit less perspective, year on year, you engender incrementalism in your thinking. What we need to get to net zero or anywhere close is really transformational. And governments aren't always brilliant at transformational thinking sometimes, but like if you go with a net zero target for the country, you will trigger a kind of, you'll necessarily force a change in what is the nature of the problem we're trying to solve here amongst the people in your organization the same way it has in ours. And that country went for a net zero target, and I heard from one of the senior officials subsequently that meeting had been instrumental in the ministers really buying in to that being the right way to go. So I guess the learnings from that is direct ministerial access is always good if you're trying to influence policy. You don't have to go in hundreds of companies. There were probably 6 in the room. And being able to talk about this as a theory of change, not just a kind of economic policy sort of pluses and minuses, but you can't do this on a classic discounted cash flow economic analysis model always, is my view. I think we have to rise above that and make some leadership calls on the future of humanity and how we get there.
And I'm going to give you a very much more sort of like working example that's still ahead of us, actually. So in Europe, last year we finished the, or was it this year? Time flies. Fit for 55 package, which is a big sort of policy package covering renewables, energy efficiency, the built environment, so on and so forth. And I think overall, we landed that in a fairly good place. But I think what's really important and where we place a lot of emphasis is then also helping the member states with implementing these directives. Because very often what we hear is that this reluctance to commit to ambition or to a certain framework is also they're just not sure how to practically go about the implementation. And as late as was it 2 days ago, I talked to the Vice Minister from Lithuania who told me that's a small member state. They don't have the apparatus in place to deal with the implementation of these policy packages, of these ambitious frameworks. So what we're really trying to do, both direct at Velux, but not least through our trade associations and alliances, is to offer very practical support. And that can sound incredibly boring. It's certainly not as sexy as your topic, right? But, you know, a webinar on Article 7.1, what have other countries learned and how can you implement, actually, in our experience from past rounds of legislation, is incredibly useful in actually tweaking that mindset from, oh my God, this is terrible, let's vote against, to actually we see the benefits, and now that we're receiving some help in implementing, we also are willing to engage. So that's the other side of it, because when you look at the Commission's own data, very often what's the issue is not necessarily a reluctance to the overall target. It's more like, how is that going to work out for us in our context? And so helping people on that really sort of like basic level by offering assistance, whether that's to authorities or to companies or to citizens, quite simply, is a huge part of the puzzle to succeed and to win more people over, I think, for more ambitious targets.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those. Those were appropriately uplifting. And now I want to open it up to the floor in terms of questions from the audience to the speakers. So,
Thank you. It seems to me the underlying assumption is that if the information on transparency is provided, that the progressive companies are able to overcome this kind of, how to make the sustainability profitable. So my fear is that we have reached the point that after Paris Agreement, that all low-hanging fruits are all reaped, and it seems that there are very difficult ones left on the trees. So do you think if we just continue to do this transparency, accountability, the information, does it reach us or you to really go to the next stage that the profitability makes is really a good business or not? I just think that we need a massive system change to make the good thing profitable, to realize, penalize, to penalize the bad thing bad. So it's my question.
thank you. I would say removing fossil fuel subsidies as a start would level the playing field between clean energy technologies and fossil fuels in most major markets. But I'm sure the panel have other ideas as well.
So just on a specific fossil fuel example, I mean, in Belgium, where I live, for instance, the subsidy on gas is 3 times higher than on electricity, making it basically completely uninteresting to buy a heat pump. So it's a really good example of a direct subsidy. So sort of from a company's perspective, I mean, we, of course, benefit from this in 2 ways. We have a product that's sustainable, but also we're a business that needs to run sustainably, right? So by having invested in as many energy efficiency measures as we could and making sure we get 100% renewable energy, we've also lowered our overall costs. And those changes are permanent, right? So I think there is that in it as well that's important to count in. So, I mean, for us, our entire business is selling sustainability, so we do make a profit. But I think what's happening in Europe at the moment is the narrative of the last 5 years was like, the twin green and digital transition, and that's now been turned into, ooh, but not too green, because that's bad for our competitiveness, which I think it's actually the other way around. If we don't become greener, then we're not going to be competitive, because the rest of the world is moving ahead, and we need to move with that world. Because otherwise we can't compete. So for me, it's an argument that's used by the people who are sort of like centre right. But what they're actually doing is therefore leaving us with the sort of industries and the sort of technologies that we've had for decades and that served us well, but won't serve us well going forward.
Yeah, maybe to pick up on the point on sort of the difficult fruit in the tree. I would agree that indeed. Both when you're producing food or household products and and personal care products, or indeed on the side of Velux in terms of building equipment, that sits much more in this is where sustainability helps in the business model, if you're really able to translate that in sort of a USP for your customers. That obviously is very different if you're selling hydrocarbons as your core business model. And I think that is also where I think Senator Whitehouse was very clear on the incentive for these type of groups of companies to really double down indeed on their corporate influence as it comes to slowing down policy making. And I think this is one of the biggest shifts that obviously is very, very challenging. We had a text last year with we need to move away from fossil fuels. The numbers this year that I've seen here being presented is that we still see an increase on oil, on gas, and on coal. So from that perspective, that hasn't materialized, and I think that's also where it is really hard for investors. That's the world that I live in, is that we obviously have a market that we, from a benchmark that we need to track. Energy sits in there, and energy is a very important contributor over the past years, which also feeds into sort of the ESG backlash that also was highlighted. So both in terms of real economy and in the financial sector, there is actually a very clear opposing movement against indeed these challenges. So that will require real leadership by politicians to set the guardrails and take some of the fossil fuel subsidies and some of the anti-climate rhetoric off the table to ultimately then also get this transition moving. So I fully agree that it is the hard fruit that is hanging there, and nobody is willing to pick it.
So yes, like there has to be a system change, I guess. I'm trying to work this out from first principles, but like the role of the transparency work in this, I think, is twofold. It's not, I mean, there's an element of this about forcing people to disclose what we would think of as bad stuff that they don't want in the public domain. But I think, I'm not sure that will change anything. If you're an oil company and you're committed to oil and you're committed to 5 degrees, then you're going to keep lobbying. If you're, I think it's much more about the progressive companies who are kind of doing the right thing on climate. They've set the targets and they don't know yet that they're spending money lobbying against what their corporate strategy is trying to achieve. And I think there's a lot of those companies. I still go to a lot of business conferences where this is a totally new issue for them. The sustainability people have no idea that lobbying is something they should be thinking about. And those companies are probably in trade associations. So I think we're still very early days in that space, and I think that's what we're playing for here.
Couldn't agree more, Thomas. I think bridging the gap between the companies that have set science-based target with companies that will advocate in line with their science-based target is a low-hanging fruit, because there are over 8,000 companies committed to the science-based target initiative, and not that many are advocating in favour of climate policies right now. So there's another low-hanging fruit we found. Rebecca.
Hi, thank you. And on to that point, Thomas, many folks don't realise that this is something that they are accidentally doing. And so my one worry here, and I'm trying to be a tiny bit provocative, is as we draw more attention to this, we are going to see increasingly those who are leaders and are doing great stuff and are moving ahead on implementation and setting targets be scrutinised on their performance on this. And I just want us to all collectively avoid bashing those people who come out with transparency on it and raise it as an issue first, and leave everyone in a position where they decide not to say anything about it, and just leave it all kind of swept under the rug. So any advice from anyone or you guys on how do we keep this something where we can see it as it's a journey, it's now an issue that we need to start tackling and speaking up more about, and not something that we start bashing people over the head with and goes backwards into hiding in the shadows.
Thank you. Who would like to take that?
Like mandatory disclosure makes it easier for everybody to see what everybody's doing. I mean, like we all now disclose our emissions. There's kind of, depending on where you draw the scope boundaries, somewhere between 50 and 100 million tons of emissions in Unilever's value chain. That's bad. People haven't thrown eggs at me yet today. So it's like, I think we've got to be honest and transparent about the moment we're in and what it's going to take. I think reporting on what you've done, we integrate our climate transition action plan reporting within our annual report and accounts now. So like annual reporting, this is what we told you we had to do last year, this is what we've done this year. That should be the same for what have you done to move forward on your climate policy agenda.
Yeah, no, I would agree, and at the same time, I think the focus should, for the right reasons, be on places where we don't see any transparency, and holding those companies accountable, and indeed not fall in the pitfall of having more line of sight on those companies that make a genuine effort and then are open about where it didn't work yet to really draw the attention there. But unfortunately, as it often goes, from a media perspective, these are the most juicy stories, so they make the headlines.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add, except I think the bigger problem is not the people who are not disclosing. The bigger problem is that so many policymakers don't care, right? Because if you're not concerned, I mean, genuinely concerned about climate change, then you're also not that concerned that these companies are or aren't contributing. And that's, I think, the bigger issue.
I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions, so I could kind of bunch them together. Oh, and then Elisa.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Owen from Nestle. Thanks very much for the panel. Really, really interesting. I have quite a direct question, which is, how do you balance political expediency with principle? Because what we're seeing at the moment is, in many places in the world, we have governments that don't necessarily agree automatically with the arguments that you might want to make in favor of a net zero transition, right? In particular, a certain forthcoming administration in the world's largest economy. You have to be realistic in what you advocate for and how you do it as a company. Otherwise, you create a situation where you create problems for your business rather than solutions. So in sort of building on Becky's question before about transparency, do we need to be transparent about where we can't actually do that, or there are limitations on how far you can push the argument without it kind of backfiring, and you need to take a bit of a different approach, which is more nuanced, and you might want to focus on different things like jobs and investment rather than talking about climate change?
Hi, Elisa from WBCSD. I speak a lot with companies and who are kind of, or like the corporate affairs leads or even CSOs who are saying like, we want to align, we want to look at our trade associations, we want to do this work, but actually like taking these steps require resources, capabilities and times that we just don't have. And mostly because their C-suite and their teams are just, they don't see the value. And obviously like we all see the value and we know that there is a really strong business case and a case. But like you guys are up here, so obviously your companies see it. What is kind of the tips that we can then go back to these companies and say like, this is how we get your CEOs on board? Like what has worked for you?
Thank you. Who would like to take which one first?
I mean, I think the answer to both of them is the same. And it's about sort of making sure that the message you are giving is appropriate to the context. So if I'm talking to the CEO about why this matters, that's a different reason than if I'm talking to my colleague in the sustainability department. And I think it's the same when you're talking about sort of the US election results and our new president over there. From our perspective, there's a hell of a lot to be done at state level, and many states in the US are either fairly progressive actually, or are interested in jobs and growth, right? And what this is also, this is a jobs and growth narrative. So for me, it's not important that they say climate. What's important is that they're actually moving ahead. And if the reason is jobs and growth, that's still progress. And there's still plenty to be done on that. And I think it's the same with the C-suite. And I was going to mention before that I think one of our successes has been that we now have a C-suite who is on board, who's fully on board. And it is about, again, sort of talking to them in a context that they understand why it's important. And that's, again, not necessarily for climate reasons, even though, I mean, in our case it is. But there can be many other reasons. And one of them is also stuff like image, branding, perception, right? That matters to companies. It matters hugely to my boss's boss, and I'm sure the same to yours. And that's where we find that for us in the markets we operate in, being strong on these topics and being strong on talking about the topics is increasingly important.
Yeah, thanks. On your question, Owen, I think obviously there is a different level of how vocal you might want to be, in particularly in the US market. But from our perspective, your fundamental views on your starting positions shouldn't change. And I think that is where you've done all the work, you've gone through all of your assessments, you've set up a sustainability strategy that is in support of reaching your climate goals, and therefore I think that should also be then also the way how you enter into any of those policy discussions. There obviously is a difference between taking a leadership position and what that means for sort of the political expediency, as you called it, in how you can deal with the government, or indeed, really going the other way and taking a position that would be against your strategy. I think that is where the space is to maneuver, which obviously is a decision you make in any market that you operate in.
Yeah, I agree, Owen. I think it's you don't change your position based on the meandering politics of any particular country, but you can always choose how to frame it, and you can always choose where to dial up and down investment in advocacy. If you think I'm not going to get a win here, then let's go and do this over here. And we have conversations all the time about which markets do we, dial up or down based on what we think we can move at a period in time. And then on the sort of CSOs who say I haven't got the resource to do this, I'm kind of inclined to be unsympathetic. I'm sympathetic with the CSOs, but like at the same time, the company is not choosing to allocate resource into that. Is also what that means. And I think that's a collective job we've got to do to make this the priority. Companies allocate resources to what they perceive to be the priorities, and they do have to prioritize. Honestly, if I had an extra 100 million, would I throw it at our decarbonisation of our factories, or do I throw it at lobbying? I'd rather throw it at lobbying at this point in time. Nobody's offered me the extra 100 million, but I keep trying. I do think it's, we're talking about a system change conversation at this point, and having 100% renewable energy powered factories is going to mean not very much if we don't get a carbon price and we don't get transition and I think we are still seeing this as a side issue, not the main issue, and I think we probably need to switch that.
Excellent. Thank you all. I think from that it became very clear on the need for a sophisticated business case for companies on why they take climate action, and it's a type of business case which means they can be taken to a local politician, it can be taken to their investors, it can be taken to their customers, and it can be taken to their employees, and therefore you do need to bottom out about the kind of materiality in your transition plan and what it really means. And at We Mean Business, over the next year or so, we will continue to push the development of that business case and the tools and how we work with companies on responsible policy engagement, so there'll be much more to come. But I'd like to thank you all for coming to this very rich discussion, and I'd like to thank each one of my panelists for their contributions. And with that, thank you very much, and I hope everyone has a good rest of COP.